that your world has been in places similar to this in the past, and you have brought us through and healed your world. It's hard for us to fathom the healing that's necessary right now in our country and really in our whole world. But we know that we're a remnant. We know that you're sovereign and that you have a plan for our lives and for the lives of this world, your world. Be with us as we learn tonight so that we can be equipped to go out and tell your truth to those in our sphere of influence and really to the whole world. But mainly it starts close to home. And let us be brave and courageous and tell the truth in everything we do and with everyone whom we come in contact with. And we just thank you for Jeffrey, for his ability to equip us to do that. It's a little scary, Lord, in this world, and we need courage to get out and to be your mouthpiece and your remnant in this world. So we ask you for your help and your guidance, and to open our minds and our hearts to Jeffrey's teaching so that we may be equipped to do that, Lord. Be with everyone here. Be with Paul and Millie. Hopefully they join us. Hopefully there's nothing going wrong with them. And we just ask you to be with us tonight and to be with everyone on this call, that they may be salt and light in their sphere of influence, and that we may turn our world around one step at a time, Lord. These things we pray in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mark. And certainly a prayer for courage on our part, as our entire culture has turned very hostile to most everything we believe, and most every way we want to live our lives. So this is unprecedented in American history. Um, American Christians have been the most privileged Christians in all of Christian history. We've been the most prosperous. We've been the most free Christians in all of Christian history. There's no assurance that that will necessarily continue, but we certainly want to pray for God's grace, and we also want to pray for great courage, as Mark just did. So now, as we go into our study this evening on parts 4 and 5 in your outline notes there, and of course, having just been through um, an Easter season, I hope your Resurrection Sunday a few days ago was very meaningful, very special for you. Um, but I was reminded of a lot of these issues we've been talking about the last several weeks, as an article came across my desk and came to my attention. And the title of this article was Warnock Deletes Easter Tweet Amid Backlash. Perhaps some of you saw this. It's a reference to Reverend Raphael Warnock, now Senator Raphael Warnock, who, according to the article, faced criticism over a tweet that he posted on Easter Sunday saying the meaning of the holiday, the meaning of Easter, quote, is more transcendent than the actual resurrection of Jesus. Let me say that again. The meaning of the holiday is more transcendent than the actual resurrection of Jesus. Now, strangely, we've been talking about this sort of thing for the last several weeks. Those who would try to convince us that we do not need to believe in an actual physical bodily resurrection of Christ, because after all, what really matters is what Christ represents. Now, that apparently is what Reverend Senator Warnock was trying to say, but his comment, his statement is totally nonsense, because to say that the meaning of the holiday is more transcendent, the meaning is more transcendent than the actual resurrection, again, that makes no sense. Because if there was not an actual resurrection, there would be no real meaning to that holiday. He goes on to say the meaning of Easter is more transcendent than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The senior pastor of New Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta said, whether you are Christian or not, he says, through a commitment to helping others, we are able to save ourselves. Again, that statement is also theologically problematic, to say the least. But anyway, it was an interesting reminder that the things that we've been talking about recently in terms of all this skepticism and cynicism regarding the historical Jesus, those issues still surface in these liberal churches with great regularity. So with that as sort of an introduction, let's move into our study for this evening, part 4, the parameters of history. And this correlates to Luke Timothy Johnson's chapter 4 in his book. And that chapter is called The Limitations of History. Now, I want to speed through this as quickly as possible so we can move on to part 5 in your outline notes. But there's some very important points in this chapter that need to be addressed. The general theme, and sort of by way of an overview, Luke Timothy Johnson is going to remind us in this chapter that history is problematic. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in detail. History is problematic. He'll talk about in what ways are the origins of early Christianity relatively accessible. In other words, in what ways do we have a pretty firm understanding of what was going on in the life of Jesus and early Christianity? What are the practical problems, though, in constructing a history of early Christianity? And why is a revisionist history of early Christianity an absolute exercise in futility? Now, again, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've been focusing on skeptics, both going back to the Enlightenment period, also more recently the Jesus Seminar, and so on. And so the question here is, why is a revisionist history such as they put forth an exercise in futility? And we'll talk about that as well. But let's begin with the nature of history. And Luke Timothy Johnson writes in this chapter that perhaps the most problematic aspect of the spate of historical Jesus books, he's talking about the Jesus Seminar and these kind of radical scholars, is the author's assumption that history is unproblematic. And he says that, in fact, reconstructing history is really not a simple process. He'll talk about how that the Jesus Seminar likes to refer to its theories as reconstructing the real Jesus, in other words, the historical Jesus, in contrast to traditional Christian ideas of Jesus, or what they call the Christ of faith. And remember, they constantly want to try and separate the Jesus of history from the so-called Christ of faith, as if they don't correlate. So what actually is history anyway? Well, it's a process of inquiry into the past. The Greek term there is historia, and historia actually means just inquiry. So history is really just a process of inquiry into the past. And there's 2 components of history. One is reconstructions of the past. In other words, our best attempts, well, for honest scholars, it would be our best attempts to reconstruct what happened, when it happened, where it happened, and who was involved in all of this, based on our best evidence, based on the facts as we know them. So history is primarily, or first of all, reconstructions of the past, but also history is interpretations of the past. In other words, why did these things happen? How did they happen? And what's the significance of these things that happened? So history is not just, plain naked facts of what happened in the past. It's how do we interpret them, the meaning of what happened in the past. Now, a simple example would be, imagine a Jewish, an honest Jewish scholar writing about World War II, as opposed to a Nazi scholar writing about World War II. Well, they may agree on most of the facts related to World War II, but their interpretations, of course, would be vastly different. And for the Nazi historian, World War II would be perhaps the worst thing that ever happened in human history, as it destroyed the Third Reich. A Jewish historian, a Christian historian, or any honest historian would take an alternate view, of course. So history is our best attempt to reconstruct what happened, but also to interpret as accurately as possible what happened in the past. And historical research, of course, is based on what we call facts. Now, a fact is something that is generally accepted as being true. And we believe that it's true based on our current understanding of the evidence. Facts are assumptions, and they are beliefs about truth. They are not the truth itself, because facts can sometimes change as our knowledge increases about something in particular. So facts are basically our best understanding based on an honest assessment of the evidence of what happened in the past. Now, historical sources, reconstructions and interpretations of the past are based on primary and secondary sources. And primary sources or primary documents are firsthand accounts. And if you have firsthand accounts of something that happened in the past, well, those are very, very valuable, to say the least. In fact, they might even be indispensable. And so this requires, of course, written communication. Um, but there is a word of caution here, because primary source documents written by somebody who claims to have been an eyewitness, they can be misleading. And that is, people who actually lived during that period, maybe even witnessed what happened, because of their bias. As you know, people tend to twist the truth and distort the facts or omit very crucial information. So we have to be aware of that. Yes, primary source documents are infinitely valuable and important, but people lie. And so even primary source documents of eyewitnesses or purported eyewitnesses, we have to evaluate, logically and rationally. They may be deceiving us. Now, also, history is based on secondary sources. These can also be very valuable. And in part, of course, secondary sources, the value of these depend on how long after the fact this written account was recorded. And also, of course, it depends on the reliability of the secondary source himself or herself. But nonetheless, secondary sources can be extremely valuable. Now, also, there's a third component, and that is oral traditions. Oral traditions can be very valuable sources. But obviously, in terms of reliability, oral sources are more problematic than our written sources, because people tend to forget things honestly, or just omit things dishonestly. So historical sources are primary, secondary, and then there's also oral traditions as well. Now, what are the limitations of history? I'm a historian, and I think that the ability to honestly, truthfully critique one's own profession is absolutely paramount. Now, that's something that a lot of people in a lot of professions seem very, very reluctant to do. But as a historian, I should be probably the most critical of my field of study, my profession. And the same thing would go, would hold true if someone were, let's say a psychologist or a sociologist, but actually most any field of work, including someone working for a large corporation, for instance. Self-criticism or the criticism of one's profession is absolutely essential. Now, what's the problems with history? Well, history is both a social science, but it's also a liberal art. in history departments back 100 years ago or more actually were in the departments of humanities in most colleges and universities. But I said history is a social science, but it's also a liberal art. Now, history is, quote, scientific in the sense that it is a systematic collection and a systematic analysis of the facts as we know them, of the evidence that we know them. So there is a scientific approach to history that needs to be respected and followed. But also, history and the writing of history is a literary creation. And so history is both a science, but also an art form. And of course, a lot depends on whether or not the historian is truly committed to the facts and to truth, or whether there's a particular, agenda that they're trying to promote. Now, history is very problematical. It's full of contingencies and it's full of qualifications. See, history, like life, is oftentimes messy and complex. It's not so simplistic. History is also very selective, and this is quite important because not everything that ever happened in the past is recorded. And then a lot of what is recorded was not recorded accurately. And not everything that has been recorded and written has been preserved. So you see there's several potential problems here. History is very, very selective. In other words, think of it this way. History is more like a sieve, which catches, you might say, the big chunks of the past. In other words, major events, very important people, major issues. So it's like a sieve that catches the big chunks. On the other hand, a lot of the smaller stuff leaks through, for instance, the lives and the lifestyles of common people in general. And so history loses a lot, over time once that generation is passed on. So history is selective. Not everything that happened in the past is recorded. Not everybody who records what happened in the past is doing it accurately or honestly. And history is more like a sieve that catches the big chunks and the smaller stuff just kind of leaks through. Now, history is also interpretive. And again, this could be a major problem because history is the product of human intelligence, but it's also the product of human imagination. See, we have to fill in a lot of gaps when we're, doing history and when we're writing history and so on. And other than indisputable facts, history is, again, say, mostly interpretations of the past. In other words, it's an attempt to make sense of what happened and why it happened and whether what happened was good or not, based on the facts as we know them. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there is no objective history, or I should say, there is no purely objective, unbiased history, because there are no purely objective, unbiased historians. See, all historians operate on the basis of certain assumptions or presuppositions. Now, for some, it's an honest attempt to reconstruct as closely as possible what happened, but others have an agenda that tends to skew the reality of what happened in the past. Okay, so history is interpretive, and there is no purely objective, unbiased history because there's no purely objective, unbiased historians. We all have our biases, our priorities, our beliefs, and so on. Now, a great Christian historian, Kenneth Scott Latourette, put it this way, and this, I believe this quote is in your outline notes. He writes, "No one writes history without presuppositions. We all have certain assumptions about what's true and not, what comports to reality or not, what's right and what's wrong, and so on. So no one writes history without presuppositions. Every attempt to tell the human story involves selectivity. You can't include everything that happened. You have to be selective. Now, back of the selection is a conviction of what is truly important. Governing this value judgment of what's truly important is consciously or unconsciously a philosophy of life. Furthermore, a sterile, quote, objectivity is not even preferable because one must actually care about what he or she is writing, researching and writing. So to be just totally detached and objective, Latourette is saying that's not even, that's not even preferable because we actually need to care about what we're researching and writing. It has to have some meaning to us. He goes on to say, truth is not attained by reason and scholarship alone. The insight that is born of faith can bring illumination. Throughout the chapters which follow, he's talking about a history that he is writing here. Throughout the chapters which follow, it's the conviction that the faith which is stimulated by contact with the Christian gospel. In other words, I'm writing based on the fact that I believe in the Christian gospel, he's saying. The faith which is a commitment to God of the whole man, body and mind and spirit, the commitment which is in response, which is the response in love to God, who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. This kind of spirit, this kind of faith opens the mind toward the true understanding of history. So what Latourette's saying is that we're all biased, we all have our presuppositions and so on. There are those who seek to tell the truth, but even that is conditioned by the state of our soul, the state of our spirit. So for those who commit their lives to God in faith in Jesus Christ, he's saying can attain sometimes perhaps certain insights that other historians perhaps would not, other secular historians, even secular historians who are trying to be as fair and honest as possible. So Latourette's saying, no, we can be, in a sense, inspired by the Spirit of God in terms of how we think about things and how we express them. Now, our inspiration is not infallible, of course. It's not on the level of Scripture. We could be wrong. But on the other hand, God can illuminate our minds. And probably, most of you could probably attest to certain times in your life when that in fact was true, that you came to an awareness of something that you had never really contemplated before. And perhaps it was a result of divine inspiration. Now, for the most part, history deals with degrees of probability rather than certainty. And here, the Denver Theological Seminary professor Craig Keener puts it this way. He says, historical methods merely offer probabilities based on limited evidence. And so we, again, in our humanness, we have to understand that we need to be humble, even if we believe that we've got a great command of a particular topic and understand it very, very well. We still need to be humble. We need to realize that our reconstructions of the past are just the best that we can do, and they're always tentative in that sense. But there is a difference between biblical history and secular history. And that comes down to the fact that biblical history is based on the element of divine revelation rather than just human speculation. And in my book on bibliology, Introduction to Bibliology, I try to emphasize that point, why it's reasonable and all to trust the reliability of biblical history. And so again, given the problematic aspects of history, going back to the Jesus Seminar, a lot of their claims sound all the more arrogant and all the more preposterous. See, they claim that they conduct their research scientifically and without bias, but that's not true at all. Uh, in fact, everything these people research and write has a hidden agenda. They just are not honest enough to tell us what their agenda is in most cases. Now, let's move on here to the next section, and then we'll pause for some interaction. The issues related to Christian history. First of all, what's the good news of Christian history and the life of Jesus as we encounter it in the Gospels? Well, we start with the fact that at its very root, Christianity is itself a historical faith. And another great Christian historian, scholar, George Ladd, put it this way: the uniqueness of the Christian religion rests on the mediation of revelation through historical events. Let me read that again. It's such a powerful and important statement by Ladd. The uniqueness of the Christian religion, you might say Christian faith, rests on the mediation of revelation through historical events. In other words, God reveals himself in the Bible primarily through historical events, not exclusively, of course, but primarily through historical events. He goes on to say that Christianity is not only a code for living, it's not only a philosophy of religion, it is rooted in real events in history. Now, compared with some other world religions, obviously Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, the origins of Christianity, see, are relatively accessible to historians. And that's very valuable. Now, most, if not all of the New Testament, there is good reason to believe was composed before the end of the first century. Now, all of Paul's letters were written by the mid-60s. He was martyred around the year 66 or 67, not sure exactly when. In other words, all of Paul's letters are written within about 35 years of Jesus's ministry, 35 years. Can you have pretty good recollection of something 35 years later? Well, absolutely. There's certain things that happened 35 years ago that a lot of us recollect very, very well. And if it were something as significant as the life of Jesus Christ, something that we had thought about, pondered, constantly interacted with others for the past 35 years about, then we'd have even sharper recollection of what happened. So all of Paul's letters are written by about the mid-60s, about 35 years after Jesus's ministry. Now, Acts of the Apostles might have been written in the early 60s, after Paul's arrival in Rome, but prior to his trial before Nero. Now, that's a very sensible assumption. See, as you know, the author of the Acts, Luke, provides a fairly detailed account of what's going on in that last several months or year or two of Paul's life. They find Paul and Luke finally arrive in Rome, and then all of a sudden the story ends. Now we know that just within a year or two of having arrived in Rome, Paul has an audience before the Emperor Nero. Surely Luke would include that in the Acts of the Apostles, unless he wrote Acts before that audience with Nero. So again, I think a very strong case can be made that Acts was probably written by about the year 62 or so. And that's very, very important, because if Acts was written in the early 60s, then the Synoptic Gospels were probably written prior to that. And that's because Luke, of course, writes the Gospel of Luke Most all Bible scholars believe that the Gospel of Luke was the third one written. First Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. And so presumably the Gospel of Luke was written by at least 60, 61. Matthew probably a year or two, or maybe several prior to that, and the Gospel of Mark prior to Matthew. Okay. Now, other evidence from secular sources confirm many of the places, many of the people, and many of the events that are recorded in the New Testament, including, let's take for instance, including places in Jerusalem that were utterly destroyed in the year 70, when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple, and so on. And so in particular, the Gospel of John and its description of geographical features in Jerusalem, such as the Pool of Siloam. Now, the Pool of Siloam was destroyed and lost to history in 70. So the assumption is that whoever wrote about the Pool of Siloam and some of the architecture and geography of Jerusalem had to have actually lived there prior to 70 and been and recollected, you know, the exact placement of those things. So that's basically what we might call the good news in terms of the origins of early Christianity. Now, what about the not so good news? Well, as with most all of history, the situation's not quite as simple as it might appear. First, there's very little evidence that survived from outside sources concerning the early Christian movement. Most everything that we know comes from Christian sources. All we have are a few non-Christian sources that provide just very general references to Jesus and the early church. Now, it's very interesting to see a lot of non-Christians think that there is absolutely no corroboration from non-biblical sources regarding Jesus and early Christianity. But they're wrong. There is corroboration from non-Christian ancient sources. But on the other hand, a lot of Christians think that there's a wealth of secular sources that confirm what the New Testament teaches. And that's incorrect as well. So there's little evidence that survived from outside sources concerning the early Christian movement. Now, secondly, most of what we do have about Jesus and early Christianity was, of course, written by Christians. They were written, at least in part, to convince other people of the truth of Jesus Christ. Obviously, the writings of the New Testament in no way are just, casual references or disinterested third parties writing about Jesus. These people all passionately believe in Jesus. And so that's a factor to take into consideration. See, now, nonetheless, the apostolic writings, the New Testament writings, these are our earliest and our best sources for the life of Jesus and the early church. They're our earliest and they're our best sources for information on Jesus and the early church. And in fact, to be more specific, they are virtually our only authoritative sources. We learn virtually nothing else about the historical Jesus or the primitive church from extra biblical sources. For instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls, what do they tell us about Jesus and early Christianity? Absolutely nothing. There's nothing in there. What about, as Kathy taught us several weeks ago, what about the information about Jesus and the early church that we encounter in the apocryphal Gospels or the Gnostic Gospels? Well, see, those are all unreliable. And in fact, most of it is just absolutely worthless, as Kathy, emphasized. Now, some of the events and writings of the New Testament can be approximated chronologically. And let's start with this. According to Luke, Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. This is Luke 3:23. So Jesus was about 30. Well, what's that mean? Well, I guess he was 29 or 30 or 31, or maybe even a year one way or the other, another year one way or the other. But also, according to Luke, see, Jesus begins his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And he also tells us that Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was the tetrarch, kind of a kinglet, you might say, kind of a very minor king. Herod was tetrarch of Galilee. Now, when Jesus attends his first Passover feast, several months after his baptism, Jewish leaders remark that the temple has been under construction for 46 years. Now, by the way, it'll be another about 30 years before it's finally completed. That temple was only completed in the early 60s, and then it was totally destroyed just a few years later in the year 70. Here's a temple that was under construction for more than 70 years, 75 years, and it lasts about 5, 6, 7 years, and then it's utterly destroyed by the Romans. So that's information that Luke reveals as well. And Jesus attends a Passover feast. He's told that the temple's been under construction for 46 years. And by the way, how do we know when the temple began being reconstructed by Herod the Great? Well, Josephus tells us that. And according to Josephus's chronology, see, Herod the Great broke ground on this new, elaborate, ostentatious temple in the year 18 BC. So when you take those comments by Luke in totality, it appears that Jesus's ministry began about the year 27 or 28. And if, in fact, Jesus's ministry lasted about 3 years, he probably was crucified at Passover in the year 30. Now, some historians, some very good historians, believe it was the year 33, but the evidence seems to argue more for the year 30. Now, in the book of Acts, there are a couple of datable events that allow us to construct a probable chronology for at least some of the events in the life of Paul. I won't mention exactly specifically what these are, but anyway, we can come up with also probable dates for at least 5 of Paul's letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and the book of Romans. Now, regarding the rest of Paul's epistles, there's really no way we can know for sure when they were written. Now, also, as I said earlier, dating the canonical Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles is somewhat conjectural as well. And as I said, and I believe that Acts was probably written around the year 62, not long after Paul and Luke arrived in Rome. Paul is being held under house arrest, awaiting an audience with Nero. Okay. And again, I think most all scholars would agree that Luke, Matthew, and Mark were probably written prior to Acts. Now, ancient sources state that the Gospel of John was written in the 90s. Now, is that problematic? Well, how old was John when he was the disciple of Jesus? We have no idea, do we? He could have been a teenager, could have been in his early 20s or whatever. But for somebody to write about Jesus 60 years after the fact, is there any reason to trust what they're writing? Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jesus is the most important person who ever lived. John was an intimate disciple of Jesus. John has been thinking about these things, teaching, corresponding, interacting with other people about Jesus in his life ever since he was a disciple of Jesus 60 years before he wrote his gospel. And so again, when it comes to is he capable to write a reliable account of Jesus's life? Well, sure. It's not that problematic, actually. Now, other books in the New Testament, like Hebrews, James, the two epistles of Peter, the epistles of John, Jude, and Revelation, we have no idea when those are written. Now, according to tradition, and this is just kind of an aside, according to tradition, Revelation was written in the 90s when the Apostle John, or John the Elder, was exiled to the island of Patmos. And he has this remarkable vision, that we read about in Revelation. Now, the early church fathers said that happened in the 90s. Most Bible scholars believe that that's the case. Also a case, however, could be made that John wrote Revelation in the 60s. And the reason is he seems to be referring to the beast of Revelation as a Neroic figure. In other words, he seems to be alluding that Nero, this debauched, degenerate, evil emperor, is that beast. Now, and again, a lot of scholars would hold to that theory that he's referring to Nero. Now, if he's writing Revelation in the 90s, Nero's been dead for almost 30 years. Why would he be writing about Nero being the beast 30 years after the man's already been dead, say? And so if you're interested, there's some sources I can refer you to. I don't think we can be definitive about any of this, but in some respects, it seems to me that it might make more sense if John were writing Revelation in the 60s when Nero was still alive and before the temple was destroyed, rather than 30 years later in the 90s. Maybe Kathy has an opinion on that, or some of the others of you. We can talk about that afterward if you'd like. So we have no idea when some of these books were written, and the lack of certainty regarding some of these books does pose a problem for any kind of precise reconstruction of early Christian history. But again, the key book, around which everything else sort of circulates, would be the Acts of the Apostles. It really provides the only narrative framework for the first 30 or so years of the Christian movement. And by the way, because Acts is so vitally important to a historical reconstruction of early Christianity, this is precisely why modern deconstructionists, people like the Jesus Seminar and so on, this is why they are so critical of Acts in terms of it being a reliable historical source. As Luke Timothy Johnson puts it, once the framework of Acts is eliminated, then the pieces of the canon can be moved around in any number of ways. So in other words, as soon as we throw out the book of Acts as being a reliable historical source, then we can reconstruct Christianity and the timeline for Christianity any way we please. Okay, we can even move a lot of these New Testament books back to the end of the first century or even into the second century, which is what a lot of skeptical scholars, in fact do. Now, let me end real quickly here with this last section of part 4, and that is revisionist scholarship and the problems of history. Now, revisionist historians face some of the same problems that confront conservative historians, and that is there simply are insufficient sources on which to base any kind of a detailed history of early Christianity. Now, Acts gives us, again, a nice framework for some of what's going on, but as far as a detailed history of early Christianity, Acts begins by focusing more on Peter and John and their ministries, and then we encounter Philip, and then the focus shifts to Paul for most of the rest of the book, doesn't it? Um, so again, there simply are insufficient sources on which to base any detailed history of early Christianity. But in fact, the problems that revisionist historians face are much greater than what conservative historians face. Because at least conservative historians have the New Testament texts and believe the New Testament texts, and these New Testament texts appear to be reliable sources by any reasonable standards of historical analysis. Now, the only reason that we would discount the reliability and the veracity of the New Testament sources, including Acts and the Gospels and so on, the only reason we would discount those is if we hold to a naturalistic or a skeptical, presupposition. In other words, if we have a bias against the miraculous, if we have a bias against the supernatural, then of course we're going to be very, very cynical about those books and so on. But outside the New Testament sources, see, revisionist scholars operate purely within the realm of their own imagination. They don't believe Acts. They don't believe the Gospels. They don't believe anything that Paul or Peter or John say about Jesus. We do, and we believe that there's good reason to. They don't. And so basically, they are operating purely on the basis and within the realm of their own imagination when they try to reconstruct who the real Jesus was, and when they try to reconstruct, early Christianity. The New Testament scholar Ben Witherington teaches at Asbury Seminary. Ben Witherington puts it this way. He says there's a considerable difference between the historical Jesus and the historically reconstructible Jesus. He goes on to say it's important to distinguish between what Jesus actually did and said 2,000 years ago and what the historical critical method, in other words, these revisionist historical methods, can discover and conclude. Now, while Christian faith has to be grounded in the historical Jesus and his ministry, this is different from claiming that it should be based on the ever-shifting tides of modern New Testament scholarship. These people can't make up their mind on much of anything, and it changes, every few years. What is true, he writes, about the historical Jesus and what the historical critical method can demonstrate are not one and the same. It goes on, what the historical critical method cannot do is to prove that Jesus did not say or did not do one thing or another. They can't prove that. They can't even prove that Jesus didn't walk on water or that there was a transfiguration or anything. They can't prove that that didn't happen. Okay? Any attempts to prove that they didn't happen just mean that they have no respect for the historicity of the Gospels. And furthermore, they have an anti-supernatural bias. Because if in fact Genesis 1:1 were true, and that is in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, if that in fact is true, nothing else that we will ever encounter in the Bible is problematic. If you have a God, an intelligent designer, a superior being who can create this universe, this complex universe ex nihilo out of nothing, all matter, time, space, and energy from nothing, then nothing we're going to encounter in the Bible in terms of miracles or whatever are a problem. So if Genesis 1:1 is true, we get a free ride through the rest of the book, right to the end of Revelation. Witherington ends with this. He says, furthermore, just because one cannot establish the authenticity of some particular saying or event, now again, we can't prove that Jesus, what he taught on the Sermon of the Mount. We can't prove it. But anyway, Just because we cannot establish the authenticity of some particular saying or event with the historical critical method does not mean that it absolutely did not happen or was not said. In various cases, the fault line may lie, number one, in the limitations of the methodology itself, or number two, in the paucity or lack of evidence at hand, or number three, in the bias or limited skills of the historian himself or herself. And one major limiting skill of modern Christian historians is none of us were there. Okay. So are there good reasons to trust what has been written? So history is all about probabilities. We can't prove any of this, just as atheists and skeptics can't prove anything. So it all comes down to, is there reason to believe these things and take them seriously? Is the Bible historically reliable? And why is it sensible and rational to believe that it is? And again, that's a point that I tried to emphasize in my book, Introduction to Bibliology. So I know we've covered a big chunk here, but let me just pause at this point, and any relevant comments or questions before we move on to a really fascinating chapter on what can we know about Jesus from the ancient historical sources.
Jeffrey, Bob Harsher.
Oh yes, Bob. Yeah.
Did you get a chance to watch the first episode of the Chosen on Sunday? Do you know what The Chosen is?
No.
It's just an excellent series. Movies. I won't explain it. I can talk to you later about it, but it is just really well.
On the life of Jesus.
And they're all on.
Bob, I don't believe I was chosen to see that.
I think you probably were. But in this,
okay. All right.
In this movie, they have an episode where they have Luke interviewing people and writing down the history. And the people themselves, the way they have it in the story, are like, well, why do you need to know this? Well, I need to know it for, historical reasons. And it's it's clear that Luke is writing a history, and it goes on for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. But I thought it was neat that they put that in there to really show visually how Luke was a great historian.
Well, and of course, he tells us in the first chapter that many people have written about Jesus. Yeah. So when is he writing his gospel? Maybe in the late 50s, maybe early 60s. And already by then, he says many people have written about Jesus, but having sort of a historical mind, he wants to write a systematic, account of Jesus's life. Rather than just perhaps anecdotes and recollections that certain people, are throwing into writing. And it is very interesting, though, if many people already had written about Jesus, and let's say this is somewhere around the year 60, well, what happened to all of that? Well, I assume that once Mark's gospel, Matthew's, and Luke's had been written, they were probably so much more in depth, and plus written by eyewitnesses or people who knew eyewitnesses, that it made those other accounts relatively insignificant by comparison. So thank you. Yeah.
So Jeff, speaking on the dating of the New Testament, to me, it's always seemed sensible, not just for textual reasons, but theological ones, that the entire New Testament was written by AD 70. Because it seems to me that, with the destruction of the temple, that was the end of any kind of biblical Judaism. Nothing after that could fit the religion laid out in the Torah. It was just, anything after that was just really a different religion altogether.
Yeah, it becomes rabbinical Judaism.
Yeah, which really is a different religion. And so to me, that always seemed like it's the final passing of the torch from Judaism to Christianity. After that, Christians are are God's people. And it's always seemed logical to me that the New Testament would have been finished by then.
Okay.
That destruction of the temple was basically God closing the first chapter of Christianity, closing the last chapter of Judaism.
Okay. Well, so why, and my apologies, I can't remember which of the early church fathers, it might have been Irenaeus, reported that John wrote the Revelation in the year 90 or whatever. Well, look, we need to keep in mind that the early church fathers are not always reliable. Okay. These are sometimes clerics in the church. Sometimes they're scholars. Some of them are even Christian apologists or philosophers, but they aren't necessarily always correct. So again, it's sort of an open question, but I think you make a good point. And maybe after our session, again, maybe Kathy would like to comment on that, and some of the others of you, and we could continue to process that. Again, the bottom line is it wouldn't matter, would it, if Revelation, if that were the last book written, if it were written in the 60s or if it were written in the 90s. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter, of course, in terms of its authenticity. But I mean, we are made in God's image, which means we have inquiring minds, and inquiring minds want to know. And so we all have a measure of, historical curiosity. Yeah.
Jeffrey Bruce.
Jeffrey, when Bob started, I'm sorry, did I interrupt somebody? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Danny, and then I'll go to Bruce here.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought Bob was going to talk about when he said Sunday. I saw the John Ankenberg show. And he had a Gary Habermas. Am I saying that correctly?
And I hear it both ways. I hear his name pronounced both ways.
He's got the program was the evidence for the historical Jesus. And and I mean, in my life, this thing about the historical Jesus and the history versus the faith is, to me, is something new. And so they were kind of commenting about that. But so
what do you mean by what you just said? That
I've always assumed that I've never heard it talked about and debated that faith is separate from the history. You know what I'm saying? And so I've always,
you knew that liberals claim that.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's just probably my lack of knowledge, but it just seems like it's kind of new to me. But
okay.
But John Ankenberg, he's a reliable guy, though, right? I mean, he's there in Gary Habermas.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my comment. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Habermas is truly a world expert on the resurrection in particular. He's also written on the Shroud of Turin, and he's a first-rate apologist.
Yeah, well, he was laying out some of the timelines on the books of written by Paul, kind of like what you were doing tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the details, because my memory's not that good. But anyway, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Bruce, you were going to say?
Yeah, well, I have a long list, and I'll make it short. Since Daniel just mentioned Gary Habermas, he was famous for always saying that when he was debating these people who, as your notes say, revisionist scholars who operate purely within the realm of their own imagination, he would always make it a point during the course of the debate to stop and say, well, excuse me just a minute, let's just hold on for a second, let's get something very clear. I have to get out a piece of paper and pencil here, because all through my presentation, I've been citing first century sources. And I missed the sites that you have for the first century sources for your opinions. And could you please let me know what they are so I can go look them up?
Yeah,
right? Well, case closed, right? Because that was just, because they didn't have any. They sat in their study and they twiddled their thumbs. They thought up something that they could make a plausible case for, but without any substance. But let me just go back for 1 second and just say, I can't let this go by. It's not an error. It's just a different perspective. Under the limitations of history, the next to last bullet says, much of history is based on probabilities, not certainties. And that's absolutely true. The fact of the matter is that most people don't understand that most of science is based on probabilities and not certainties as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
We have very few things that we are certain about. We hold everything, including how far away the sun is and the speed of light and all that, at in a sort of limbo, because new evidence could come in which would show something different, and we would have to respond to that. So it's not a slam dunk condemnation of history that it's based on probabilities.
No, not
Because
at
the
all.
thing which our society tells us we should pay attention to, follow the science, right, is
Mhm.
also based on probabilities.
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent point.
And,
Thanks.
and having said that, to the not so good news, and Dan wrote this about Luke. I think Luke has been found to be one of the most reliable historians in history.
Mhm.
There is just absolute legions of detail about where the ships went on their voyage. They go from this port to that port, and then they went to Malta, and then they went to Rome, and what the weather was like at a certain time, and how the currents flowed, so they couldn't start until Tuesday, and all these kinds of things about people, rain titles, and when they, nobody even knew that Pontius Pilate existed, because there wasn't any physical documentation of him until the 1960s, when they found a stone with Pontius Pilate engraved on it, right? But Luke is pinning these people down all the time. So he was an absolutely extraordinary historian. So that, but I yes, again, it comes from one of the books that is one of the synoptic gospels, and also an Acts, which is also associated with it.
Mhm.
But then there are people like Richard Balcom, who wrote Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and I won't get into that. I mean, someday we'll talk about that, and the naming in the New Testament, and how the names indicate so clearly that these books were written by eyewitnesses, because they wouldn't have gotten these names right. They wouldn't have known whether to call somebody Simon or Ebenezer or whatever if they were making them up. And one of the things that we see when we look at the things like the Apocryphal and the Gnostic Gospels is that names are very sparse. They don't use them very much. They don't even talk about Jesus. They talk about the teacher, and so it's very, very vague. And it's vague because I think it was written in the 100s, the late 100s, the 200s, and they didn't know what people would call back then, and what would have been a legitimate name for the disciples of Jesus or what have you. Sort of looking in the synoptic gospel. So anyway, just some thoughts that came to me as we wandered our way through this.
Yeah. Now, of the four gospels, the one that's most historically suspect in the minds of many people is John. But that's why I mentioned John a while ago, with his incredible detailed descriptions of some of the geography and architecture of Jerusalem. Nobody could have written that who didn't actually live or visit Jerusalem during the time of Christ, and certainly before the year 70. So this idea that John's gospel was, we can consign that to the 2nd century, makes no sense. It had to have been written by somebody who, again, was very familiar with Jerusalem.
Jeffrey, if I can add one more thing, I mean, that we don't really understand how prodigious the memories were of people, and how, because they didn't have written text. It wasn't that they were necessarily better at it, but it was a facility which they had cultivated in their lives, because they had to memorize things because they didn't have anything else to look at. Now, I did graduate work in linguistics, and the Indo-European languages started in India with something called Proto-Indo-European, which was the Aryan invaders which came down, and they had the first Hindu texts, the Vedic texts, and the Upanishads, and so forth. And they used to assign them out to people, and they would memorize, like you memorize every even syllable, and you memorize every odd syllable, and you memorize it forward, and you memorize it backwards. And these people would all do this fantastic feat of memory, and then they could get together and compare and make sure that they actually had the original text. I'm not saying they did that in Jerusalem or anything like that, but this was much more common in the pre-literate world, or the barely becoming literate world, as it was in Jesus' time, than we could even possibly imagine. People had to memorize a whole book of the Bible to become a catechized Christian in some of the early church circles. So.
Right, and in terms of reconstructing some of what Jesus taught, well, all Bible scholars believe that Jesus probably taught these things multiple times. And so his disciples are listening very attentively. And, after you've heard some of this several times, I mean, even decades later, you can reconstruct it pretty accurately. Yeah. So, well, anything else before we move on then to the next part of our study? All right. Well, let's move on then to part 5, Jesus and History. This correlates to chapter 5 in Luke Timothy Johnson's book, The Real Jesus. This is a chapter that he entitles "What's Historical About Jesus?" And so, by way of just kind of a general introduction here, the issues are what do we actually know about the historical Jesus? What are the positive and the negative aspects of the 4 Gospels in terms of understanding who Jesus was and what Jesus taught and what he did? What do New Testament writings other than Gospels tell us about Jesus? What do extra biblical sources tell us about the historical Jesus? So very interesting topic in this chapter. So if you look there at the historical problematics, interpretive complexities, the point is simply this: since history is interpretations of the past, in other words, it's an attempt to make sense of the past, no topic in history is without its challenges. Even if somebody today were writing a biography, let's say of John F. Kennedy, the historian would still face formidable problems in terms of interpretation and meaning when it comes to John F. Kennedy's life and presidency and so on. Now, here's a very interesting case study that Luke Timothy Johnson puts forth, and that is, let's compare the historical Socrates with the historical Jesus. I mean, just compare them as historical figures, not that, they're equal or anything like that. But Luke Timothy Johnson begins this chapter by drawing a comparison between the problem of reconstructing the, quote, historical Socrates and the challenges we face in terms of reconstructing the historical Jesus. But I should say at the outset here that the comparison ultimately fails, even as Johnson himself admits that this is in no way a direct, comparison here. But nonetheless, we can learn something from this. See, nobody would deny that Socrates, there was an actual historical Socrates, and that he lived and died in Athens in the late 5th century. If I remember correctly, he dies in 404 BC. There are several reputable sources that bear witness to the life of Socrates. Nobody would deny that Socrates was a very famous man in Athens during its time, or that he was a very controversial man in Athens in his time. But exactly who and what was the historical Socrates? See, that's the question. The sources are written either during or immediately after Socrates' lifetime. And yet these sources offer contrasting perspectives on Socrates. And in fact, the so-called historical Socrates is rather elusive and rather hard to reconstruct. Now, according to Aristophanes, for instance, a great poet of the day, Socrates was a total charlatan. He was a pseudo-philosopher. And Aristophanes, in his work called The Clouds, he has Socrates suspended above the ground in a basket, overlooking what's going on beneath him, babbling nonsense and meddling in other people's affairs. That's Socrates according to Aristophanes. Now, the historian Xenophon presents Socrates as a very common sense moral teacher. Xenophon writes works like Symposium and memorabilia and things like that. And then we have a third source. So we have Aristophanes, we have Xenophon, but then we have Plato, the great philosopher Plato. And for Plato, see, Socrates is this profound mystical philosopher. He's basically a Greek prophet. Not that he's infallible, of course, like, New Testament or Old Testament prophets, but he's a prophet for his time. So the question is, we've got Aristophanes, we have Xenophon, and we have Plato. And all three of them have contrasting views of who this man was. So the question is, who actually was the real Socrates? Who was the historical Socrates? And Luke Timothy Johnson puts it this way. He says, ultimately, the historical Socrates cannot be separated from the Socrates of his interpreters, because that's all we've got are these three sources, and they differ. Now, as you know, it was Plato's Socrates who inspired succeeding generations of thinkers, including Christians, including many Christians from Augustine to Søren Kierkegaard in the 1800s, as well as millions and millions of people down to the present who read about Socrates and his life are very, very inspired by it. Well, that's the view of Socrates that we get through Plato, see. Now, Luke Timothy Johnson goes on to say, in reality, the Socrates of history is less important than the Socrates of myth. In other words, what Socrates actually represented, the meaning of his life. It's what Socrates represents, according to Johnson, that has so profoundly affected people throughout the centuries. Therefore, he says, it is the remembered Socrates or the interpreted Socrates, the Socrates of faith, you might say, who continues to inspire us today. And that ultimately is the real Socrates. Now, I would take exception, though, to what Luke Timothy Johnson's writing here. I think it's a false analogy. And in fact, Johnson even admits that it's not a direct analogy, because obviously Socrates, you can believe in him or not, and it probably is not going to greatly impact your life. He never claimed to be the spiritual savior of mankind. And his authority was not dependent upon a historical fact. Whereas in the case of Jesus, who claims to be divine, who claims to be the spiritual savior of mankind, Jesus's authority does in fact depend on a historical fact, and that is the miracle of the resurrection. That validates everything that Jesus taught and everything that Jesus did. Also, there's a fundamental difference here. The New Testament sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul's writings and so on, despite differences sometimes in details, they all present a unified and consistent portrayal of Jesus. So in that sense, the analogy between the historical Socrates and the historical Jesus crumbles. Okay. Now, what do we get with the New Testament material? Let's start with the Gospels. All right, it's important to keep in mind that the Gospels are not biographies in the modern sense of what a biography is. See, no modern biographer would skip over his subject's entire childhood, except maybe one incident or whatever. And no modern biographer would just totally omit what happened during this person during those very critical formative years. And no modern biographer would start with, okay, so-and-so was 30 years old, and then go on, and without hardly anything prior to that. No modern biographer would devote half of his biography to one single week in the subject's life, such as John does in the Gospel of John. Half the book is 1 week, basically, or almost half of the book. Also, no modern biographer would ignore the personal and the private life of his subject and focus only on the subject's public life. And yet that's what we get with the four gospels. There's no insight into the personal private life of Jesus. The focus is exclusively on his public life. Although we are told that, he oftentimes retreated, sometimes for entire nights in communion with God and so on. But we're not told anything specific about that. So the Gospels, it's important to keep in mind, are not mini biographies, M-I-N-I, mini biographies. Justin Martyr, the great Christian philosopher of the mid-2nd century, one of the great church fathers, Justin Martyr called the Gospels the memoirs of the apostles. And of course, he believed that these were divinely inspired memoirs of the apostles, but that's how he described the Gospels. Bruce Metzger, great New Testament scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, died about 15, 20 years ago. Bruce Metzger refers to the Gospels as interpretive portraits of Christ. Now, Bruce Metzger also believed these were divinely inspired interpretive portraits of Christ. Now, Luke Timothy Johnson calls the Gospels literary compositions, but again, that term can be misleading. Now, a second point about the Gospels were written several decades after the fact. Most all scholars agree that they were composed by the end of the 1st century. Even probably most liberal scholars say that they were written near the end of the 1st century. Some push them into the 2nd century. But most all scholars agree that these accounts of Jesus' life were written within the lifetime, at least, of those who would have actually seen Jesus in the flesh. Now, many conservative scholars believe the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written within about 30 years of Jesus' ministry, and that's what I was arguing, earlier, probably by the year 60. Liberal scholars, of course, want to push the dates back as far as possible into the end of the 1st century or even into the 2nd century. And again, most scholars believe that the Gospel of John was probably written in the 90s. And as Eric pointed out and so on, I mean, there's reason to question that. But nonetheless, that would be the latest. Now, going back to Socrates, in his case, see, all the written accounts about his life were composed either during his lifetime or within a few years after he died. And those who knew, those who wrote about Socrates knew him while he was alive, or at least they purported to. Now, in the case of Jesus, 2 of the authors, Matthew and John, knew Jesus personally. 2 other authors, Mark and Luke, got their information from those who did know Jesus in the flesh. Luke, again, as we said, he interviewed people as extensively as possible. In the case of Mark, where did he get his information about Jesus? Well, according to tradition, and it's worth taking seriously, Mark got his information about Jesus primarily through Peter. So the Gospel of Mark is more like Peter's gospel. Okay. Now, thirdly, we all understand that the Gospels are biased. They were all written from the perspective of faith, and they all proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel. He was the incarnate Son of God. He was the Savior of humanity. Now, see, while this does not pose a philosophical problem that these accounts are biased, it is a problem from the perspective of historical criticism, because in the case of Socrates, again, we have one dissenting voice, Aristophanes, who presents a radically different view of Socrates than the other 2 do. The other 2 are respectful or even adoring of Socrates. In the case of Jesus, though, there are no other voices outside the Gospels in the New Testament until we get into the 2nd century and some of those writings, which, as we said, are largely worthless. And again, as Kathy was teaching a few weeks ago, the so-called apocryphal Gospels. Well, some of those were probably written by professing, believing Christians. Nonetheless, they are largely legendary accounts. They were written in the 2nd century or even later, and those apocryphal Gospels actually offer very little, if any, reliable information on the life of Jesus Christ. Okay, so we're saying the Gospels are biased, but in fact, every writer, every historian, every biographer has their biases and their agenda. The issue is not if a writer is biased, but rather whether his bias correlates to reality, whether he's honest and thorough in his research and his presentation. See, writers with strong, passionate biases who are also committed to the truth, they can still treat their subject fairly and honestly. Sometimes those with the most passionate biases are most concerned with preserving the truth of a historical person or a historical event. And again, I would cite, for instance, a lot of the early accounts of the Holocaust were written by Jews. All these people were biased. They were all prejudiced. They hated Nazis and they hated, the Nazi regime. But that doesn't mean in any way they're incapable of writing the truth about the Holocaust or the truth about the Third Reich. Now, significantly, Jesus's enemies did not ever dispute that Jesus had taught the things or even done the things that are recorded, including his miracles. Rather, you remember the basis on which his critics criticized him. They accused Jesus of speaking blasphemy. They didn't say that he didn't claim to be equal to God. They just said that that's blasphemous. And then furthermore, they didn't even claim that he had not performed at least some of the miracles that are attributed to Jesus. Rather, they said that he did these miracles on the Sabbath. He broke the Sabbatical law. And also he did these miracles by the power of Satan. So see, at this point, Luke Timothy Johnson then discusses the supposed internal problems of the Gospels. In other words, they don't all agree on all the specifics. And we'll talk more about this in coming weeks. But in fact, again, see, that is not evidence of a problem so much as it demonstrates that there was no conspiracy, there was no collusion among Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to manipulate the details of Jesus's life. Now, what is it that 2 or 3 people who have just been arrested for committing a heinous crime, if they have any time to consult before they're taken into the police precinct and interrogated privately and what do they do first? They want to make sure that all 2 or 3 of them have their story straight, see, because their story is a lie. They're claiming to be innocent. So they need to be sure that they get all the details right. Now, what we find in the Gospels are variations in the minor details of the life of Jesus to some extent. And what that does is show that there was no conspiracy, no collusion on the part of these gospel writers to manipulate the life story of Jesus. See, and again, now this would only be a problem, by the way, for people who hold to the theory of strict inerrancy. But otherwise, and we'll talk about this again in coming weeks. Now, number 4, and I see that we need to wrap this up real quickly here. Number 4, the gospel narratives contain miracle stories that are beyond the bounds of historical analysis. A historian cannot check the facticity or verify the authenticity of these miracle accounts. And yet we have to assume that if these are credible sources, then they're, giving us the straight scoop. Again, everything from raising someone from the dead to the transfiguration and so on. So let me just very quickly here, in summary, as you see there in your notes on page 32 of your notes. Okay, so given all these limitations we've mentioned, the Gospels still provide ample evidence that they are reliable. And Luke Timothy Johnson puts it this way: the accounts of Jesus's last days, for instance, are absolutely remarkable for the way they present a very lengthy, very sequential, and a very connected story. Furthermore, they are notable for the attention that they give to details, including the time and place that events happened. Most remarkable is the high degree of agreement among these four versions. The story of Jesus also intersects explicitly with the realm of real history. Jesus is shown encountering well-known institutions, certain people, certain situations, and other historical evidence that can be verified from other ancient sources. I was talking about the Gospel of John in particular in that respect. Now, for honest scholars, the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus pose absolutely no insurmountable problems in terms of their historical credibility. The only scholars that would have a problem are scholars who are already prejudiced against the Gospels or have a naturalistic bias against the supernatural. Now, an atheist would say, no, this is preposterous. People don't, work miracles and all this sort of thing. Well, that's the presupposition of an atheist. The question is, whether that's valid or not. And I'll end with this quote here from Craig Blomberg of Denver Theological Seminary. When sources, and this is such an important point, when sources repeatedly prove themselves to be trustworthy, where in cases where they can be verified, then they should be given the benefit of the doubt where they cannot be verified. If you know somebody who is honest and upright and, is never deceived you or anything like that, even if that person were to say something that's a little bit questionable, you would tend to give them the benefit of the doubt, because after all, they seem to be perfectly credible people. They're not pathological liars or anything like that. So Blomberg goes on to say, this is what is known as placing the burden of proof on the skeptics when it comes to gospel historicity. Now, Søren Kierkegaard in the 1800s is quite correct in saying that there is ultimately a leap of faith that goes beyond what historical evidence can provide. That's true. But contra Kierkegaard, in other words, in contradiction to what Kierkegaard's implying there, what Christians believe is not an absurd leap of faith. And one may liken the situation to a long jumper who runs as fast as she can down the track, but ultimately must leap into the pit beyond the track, the last, 25 or 30 feet or whatever. So she's on very solid ground running down the track. Then she has to fly that last, little bit. Now, historical evidence moves us a long way toward demonstrating our belief as a result, and as a result, the faith that is necessary to fill in the remaining gap is reasonable. So when we talk about a leap of faith involved in Christianity, yeah, there is, but it's more like a long jumper, who flies that last little bit after sprinting down the track on solid ground. A proper historiography must allow for the miraculous as a possible explanation for events that cannot be plausibly explained otherwise. The only way to avoid this conclusion is to begin with an anti-supernatural or atheistic bias. If there is a God similar to the one that theists postulate, in other words, similar to the God that's revealed in the Bible, then it is eminently reasonable that at times of his choosing, God might wish to intervene in the space-time universe and generate events not otherwise attributable to natural processes. That makes perfect sense. Again, if Genesis 1:1 is true, nothing else we encounter in Scripture should be all that problematic. So ultimately, whether it's Jesus or Socrates, the most crucial thing about that person is precisely what critical historiography cannot provide, and that is the meaning of that person's life. Meaning comes from the interpretation of the facts rather than the facts themselves, according to Luke Timothy Johnson. So the Gospels, despite agreeing on some specific, the Gospels, despite disagreeing on some specific details, are remarkably consistent when it comes to what's important. In other words, they are absolutely consistent when it comes to the meaning of Jesus' life, the purpose of his life and his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. So, time to exhale. And my apologies for going a few minutes over time. I hope that was helpful. I think these two chapters in Luke Timothy Johnson's book just have so much critical information that it's important to go through this systematically. There's so much there that we would benefit from absorbing, and I think he does generally quite a good job in this. So why don't we open things up here, those of you who can stay on for a few more minutes. And Kathy, if you wouldn't mind kind of starting us off, either something that we specifically addressed tonight or anything that's tangentially relevant.
Well, I think just as I've been listening tonight, and just the Lord continues to impress on us, or on me anyway, is the fact that what Danny had said about faith being so vital, and you've mentioned twice now, if you can believe that Genesis 1:1 and faith, then the rest of it is not problematic. And I think that's interesting because in Hebrews 11 verse 3, it says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And then verse 6 says, without faith it is impossible to please God. And so I think that we can have confidence as Christians. We should absolutely open our minds to understand these things, but we don't have to be afraid that any branch, science, archaeology, the social sciences, none of those things are going to disprove the word of God, because God has said, it is my word, it is true. Jesus said, not a jot or tittle will pass, will not be fulfilled. And the word will always be true and always be shown to be true. Just what Bruce said, for the longest time, they didn't think there was a pilot. And yet now archaeology has revealed his name. So I just think we don't have to be afraid. We can be confident in standing on the truth that we know. And certainly knowing some of these, facts and things obviously helps our case. But there is a mysterious marrying of facts and faith, and we need to lean toward faith a lot of the time.
It's again contra Kierkegaard. In other words, in contrast to